Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Trainers Forum presented by HRD Specialized Canine Training. And I'm Paul Martin, your host. And tonight we have as our guest Dr. Lauryn DeGreeff. And I probably just butchered her last name, but she comes to us from the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, where she's a research chemist and also is part of the faculty there at Florida International University. Made Lauryn feel a little bit older than she really expected to earlier when I commented to her that I'd been aware of her research for about a decade and so forth. So she's got quite a few articles out there in the world on, I guess, the research side of odor. And so with that, I have to share one of my favorite pictures of her there with the two technologies or two of the technologies she gets to work with. So at this point, I'm going to stop blabbering on and just say thank you for joining us. And we're going to switch screens.
Okie dokie. Let me see here. All right. Thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. Can you see my slides okay?
They're coming through great.
Fantastic. And you did not butcher my last name. It was perfect. So get points for that. Before I get going, I just want to let everybody know that this research was not done on behalf of the U.S. Navy, that this research was done prior to that, and that it is my opinion and not theirs. So we can't get into any trouble. So as Paul mentioned, I am currently at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. It's in Washington, D.C. I am currently sitting in Naples, Florida, because it is snowing in Washington, D.C., or it's going to soon, or it just did, or something, and I don't like snow. So taking a little break. But I've been at Naval Research Laboratory since 2012. I'm an analytical chemist, which is basically a chemist that plays with instruments. Conveniently, one of my instruments, as Paul showed in the picture, is detector dogs. They're my favorite type of instrument because they are fluffy and much happier. So at the Naval Research Laboratory, I started off looking at training aids relating to explosives. And now I've moved a bit more into general detection dog type research questions and also some stuff with narcotics and fentanyl. I'm also faculty at Florida International University, and I've been overseeing research projects related to narcotics training aids, as well as some cross-contamination questions for training aid scent kits. Before I was at the Naval Research Laboratory, I did an internship at the FBI for almost 2 years, working with Brian Eckenrode and Rex Stockham and Craig Schultz. And that's where I did a lot of my characterization of living human and cadaver scent. And prior to that, I did my PhD at Florida International University in forensic chemistry, where I was also looking at living and deceased odor. Okay, so just so we can all get on the same page, I presume most of you know this, but it always works better when we all start with this understanding the same things. So I'm a chemist and I try to figure out what dogs are smelling. And I do that by looking at the odor, and that those questions may answer how to make better training aids or why a dog is alerting to one thing and not another, how to adjust the amount of odor they're giving, all kinds of things like that. But the basic premise is that the dog has to be able to smell an odor to be able to detect it. And in order to smell it, it has to be in the gas phase. So just like you can only drink a liquid, you cannot drink a solid, you can only smell something that's in the vapor phase. So it has to be a gas. So if you are smelling your coffee, you are not smelling the liquid in the cup, you are smelling the gaseous vapors that are coming out of the cup. So that is the base. So the dog is not, for HRD, they're not smelling that body on the ground, they're smelling the vapor that's coming off of it. In explosives and narcotics, a lot of the time, the scientists like myself have a lot easier time because there may only be 1 or 2 chemicals that represent the particular target. So if you think about cocaine, for instance, the cocaine is, the molecule of cocaine itself is not readily detected in the vapor phase. It is too big of a molecule. It doesn't like to be a gas. It's a solid. Can't. So you really wouldn't be able to smell it. On the other hand, we are lucky enough that a smaller molecule comes off of the cocaine when as it decomposes under normal ambient conditions. That chemical is methylbenzoate, and that's what gives cocaine its odor. It smells a little bit like grapes. So those of you who have sniffed cocaine for any reason, it might smell a little bit like grapes, and that is the methylbenzoate. So that is an odorant, is what we call that. That is what gives the odor that is detected by the dog. However, for things like HRD, it's not a single odorant that makes up that odor, but an entire odor profile. So it's a collection of odorants. So I'll be talking a lot about odor profiles or scent profiles as we go on today. So I am going to gloss over these basic decomposition slides. I'm sure Paul would want to correct me through them. I'm sure that I am, this is a little bit outside of my direct field, as I am a chemist and not an anthropologist, but just so we're all on the same page. So we'll talk a little bit about decomposition, which begins the second that you die and you start to have autolysis of cells, which is basically the breakdown of cells. Tissues break down, and so as soon as you die and you start to have these cells, theoretically you do start to have vaporous products being produced. It doesn't necessarily mean you can detect them immediately upon death, but they are starting to be produced. Then you get into the anaerobic breakdown of the macromolecules. So now you have big molecules in the body that are being broken down into gaseous products due to bacteria in the body. These gases build up. They cause the skin to loosen, it gives it, and eventually it ruptures. And at that point, you give off a lot of that vapor. So now you have a lot of gas available. And now you can have the aerobic breakdown of the body until you get to the skeletonization. So here are the 5 stages. They have different names. These are the ones that I am going with at the moment. But the thing to highlight here is, again, when you, upon death, in the stage 1, you have more of a subtle odor. Stage 2, during bloating or putrefaction. Yes, what did I do wrong?
Yes. Your slides are not advancing.
Oh no. Well, so am I still on the first slide to
there
you?
We go. I guess you were, and then you momentarily.
Where did we leave off?
I think you were at slide 7 is what momentarily flashed up.
So I'm on 1 now. Can you tell me, do you see the disclaimer now?
I'm on 1. I do not see the disclaimer, but
okay, we're gonna do this a different way. We're going to not use the animations. How about if I just click them like this and not go in slideshow?
Okay.
Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, we're gonna go with that. There will be, you all will miss out on the animations, but at least we get slides advancing. All right, so none of these were like horribly important to see. And I'm happy to give people PDFs of the slides also. So this is where we left off. Everybody, you can see stages of human decomposition. We're good for the moment?
Yes.
Okay, well, fabulous. Moving forward, All right, so here we go. We've got stage 1, fresh. The key here for us is that there is subtle odor. Stage 2, during bloating, most of the gases are still within the body, so there is an odor detectable, but you get a peak amount of odor at stage 3 when the skin ruptures. And then as you start to lose the body mass, the odor is reduced until you get to skeletization. So that's the big takeaway there. So from my side of things, what I care about is that you have these large macromolecules in the body. You have your proteins, your carbohydrates, and your lipids. The thing about large molecules is that large molecules do not like to be in the gaseous phase. They like to be solids or maybe liquids, but they do not float up into being gases. So the large molecules you can't smell. So, but as decomposition happens, you start to have the breakdown of those large molecules, and that's where you get the production of the gaseous molecules. So the proteins will undergo proteolysis, and it will be broken down to amino acids. Amino acids are still too big to smell generally, but they will undergo deamination, decarboxylation, and I can't say this one, sulfhydration. It's still butchering it, but we know what we're going with. And that's going to produce your ammonia, your cadaverine, and purine, although that's still a bit sketchy on whether or not that really happens and if it's really volatile or not. And then a number of nitrogen and sulfur containing compounds. So the carbohydrates first break down to the glucose monomers, and then beyond that, during aerobic environments, you get organic acids. In anaerobic, you get specifically and acetic acids and the related alcohols. Fun fact, the butyric acid is the smell of vomit. So that's nice, right? Okay, moving on. Lipids. Lipids undergo hydrolysis, and they produce the saturated and unsaturated fatty acids, which in an aerobic environment yield aldehydes and ketones, and in an anaerobic environment get saturated fatty acids. And each of those compounds are going to have a different type of smell. When they are in a group, like let's say all the organic acids, they kind of might have a similar smell to one another, versus organic acids and aldehydes might smell very different, generally speaking. So I took this out of one of Sherry Forbes' papers because I thought it was a really nice diagram of generally how one might obtain an odor profile of, in this particular case, it was a dead pig, but you get the idea. So you might have some kind of burial, or in this case, it is a surface. So the animal's sitting on surface and they have a hood over it. And then you have some kind of sampling apparatus. In this case, there's a tube where the air is pulled out. It is collected in that tube and then it is brought back to the lab. And the way I look at most of my data, it ends up looking like this thing on the far right, these bars here. And what this bar graph shows is that each color is a different compound or class of compounds, and the size of that bar or the size of that color is how much is there. So you're looking at relative ratios. This is not the exact setup I used, but I thought it was a really nice depiction. So here's a nice, this is actually not Forbes. This is the German people whose name I can't pronounce. So this is really nice though, because it shows the pictures versus stage of decay, visual stage of decay versus what it looks like for the amount of odor. So when they say number of VOCs, basically that's the amount of odorants that we collected or they collected off of that animal in this case. So the number of VOCs is the number of different odorants. So as you can see, it gets very, very complicated, and that the active decay stages, which is what they're calling it here, have the greatest amount of odor and the greatest complexity of odor. So if you think about when, and I'll get back to this in a little bit, but when maybe somebody, some commercial entity is trying to make a mimic of human decomposition, if you look at the fact that at active decay, they have nearly 250 different odorants, you can see why making a mimic might be rather difficult. Like, what do you select? What is the dog hitting on? What's most important? It's quite challenging. So as you all probably know, there are a number of different factors that affect decomposition. I tried to break it down, the green factors being things that increase the rate, and the red or purple, as it may be here, are those that slow. So the condition of the body, whether there's an injury and an open wound, or the person's age or BMI, that's going to affect the rate of decomposition. In particular, wounds open to the environment will increase access for insects and bacteria. Whether a body is wrapped in clothing or something else, the clothing can provide protection, which can slow decomposition. And I said this backwards, but that's okay. And on the other hand, it can also create a nice place for maggots and other creepy crawlies to live, increasing decomposition. Whether the body's indoors and outdoors, whether it's buried, is there access to insects and other animals, and then environmental factors. And I know I was told that you all are interested particularly in freezing, so I'll touch on that a couple of times here. There are not a lot of studies about how specifically freezing affects decomposition, but I pulled as many studies as I can, and I've tried to include them throughout my discussion. So as you would know, temperature affects decomposition, moisture and humidity. So if you have humidity, that kind of moisture, environmental moisture, it can encourage the growth of microorganisms, which can speed up decomposition. But if you are actually submerged in water and the water is cooler, that might slow decomposition. So here is a great study by Sherry Forbes. She compared directly two different environments, one body in winter and one in summer. And I should have looked, but I don't actually know if this is, I think this was done in Canada, so I think this is human, but it could be pig. I should have checked. I apologize. Paul, do you know if this is human or pig by chance?
With it being in 2014, I believe she would have been in.
That's Australia.
Australia.
Yeah. So okay. So that's pig. Well, nonetheless, we moving on. Okay. So
well, with it.
Go ahead.
Yes, with it being 2014, it's definitely going to be pig, because I do believe that was prior to them getting remains in either one of those locations that she works in.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, so we're looking at pig here, but the general trends remain the same. So in winter, as one would expect, you see extended decay ranges. So each decay stage lasts significantly longer. I tried to label these on here with the number of days that the pig stayed in each stage in the winter, which is the top, versus the summer at the bottom. But either in winter or summer, you saw a similar rapid increase in the number of VOCs and the amount when they reached the active decay stage. So you're reaching the stages at different spots, but either way, they're both kind of giving you the same trends. What else is interesting is that the type of VOCs, so the type of odorants or what that odor might have actually smelled like, were very similar at each stage, even though they happened at different times. So that was a really important finding of hers, was that in the winter, yes, it takes longer to get to that stage, but the odor is still going to be similar. And that's really important for training, because you obviously have to work with the environment that you have. So you might be training in the summer, but then you might have a big search coming up in the winter, and you can be confident that the odors that the dogs were dealing with in the summer were indeed similar to that in the winter. There's more of it in summer. There's more volatile compounds available, but the odor itself was similar. All right, so before I get into discussion about training aids, I want to talk a little bit about some of the research that I did, just because I like it, basically. So I did 3 small projects that at some assumptions that I found in the HRD and living human scent detection community. So the first assumption is that dogs that are trained to find living people do not find deceased, and vice versa. So I call these assumptions, but these are really things that people say based on anecdotal evidence. And we are, feel pretty comfortable that these are true, but we do not have any scientific evidence to prove it. So if you were to have to go to court and discuss one of these findings, you don't have the scientific evidence to back it up necessarily. So that's assumption one, is dogs trained to find living people will not find deceased, and vice versa. Assumption two is that properly trained cadaver dogs will only find human remains and not animal. We're going to leave the whole pig human situation aside for the moment. And assumption three, this was looking particularly at blood detection dogs, but blood is often used as a training aid for HRD. So we'll discuss it anyway. Blood detection dogs will locate human bloods of all ages, even if they're trained on the same training aid over and over again that you keep in your freezer and may not, or refrigerator, and may not be super fresh. So looking at assumption one, the living versus deceased. So as I explained before, this is kind of how I look at my data. So again, each color here is a different compound, and then the size of the bar, the size of that color is how much is there. And the reason why we do it like this is because we can visually very easily see a change in pattern. So on the left, you're looking at the odor profiles from 7 different living humans. And what you see here is that there are some compounds in common between all of them. They all have that kind of lavender color, well, I guess a medium lavender color and a lighter lavender color. But there is quite a bit of variation between people. So this is why bloodhounds might be able to follow a specific person to a crime scene. If you look over on the right, these are odor profiles from 6 different deceased people. 3 were taken in a morgue and 3 were taken in a crematorium. It was done this manner so we could rule out any background odor from the sampling location itself. And what you see here is that the deceased compared to the living, the deceased odor profiles look very, very similar to one another, which one is a reason why a dog indeed might not find a dead person if they're trained on living, or vice versa, but also why you do not have dogs finding specific deceased people. This is a statistical way of looking at it. This is the exact same data, but put in principal component analysis, which is just a simple multivariate statistic. So basically the red dots are the humans, and what you see is that those red dots do not group super closely together. They're spread out because there's differences between them. And then the black triangles group a bit closer together. Those are the deceased people, and they group closer together because they are more similar. So here we have the chemical analysis supporting the anecdotal evidence. Going into assumption 2, the deceased human versus animal scent. So on my right, I have 4 of those 6 humans that we saw in the previous slides, with their odor profiles looking pretty similar to one another. And then you have a variety of different animals taken in different locations. So the canines, that was from when I was at the crematorium, there was an animal crematorium nearby. So I got 2 pet dogs that's there. And then you see a variety of other, the chicken was whole, and then the other ones, the tuna, the lamb, the pork, and the beef from restaurants. And you can also see that they have unique odor profiles. And then again, when you look at these statistically, what you see here is that, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the humans are over on the left together. All of the other mammals are up there in the corner together, which is really interesting because the canines were whole bodies, the chicken was a whole body, and then the other things were pieces of meat from a restaurant. And then the tuna is down here by itself because it smells really bad. But again, what we're seeing is that the chemical analysis is supporting the anecdotal evidence. And then finally, for the third assumption, this is relating to blood aging blood. So this was a really fun study because I got my blood taken about 1 million times over a 6-month period, because I used my own blood for this, of course. We actually used myself and 2 of my other wonderful coworkers so we could have a nice average. But okay, so on the left of this, you see fresh blood. So you see immediately out of our vein to 8 hours. And then you see day 1 and day 2, and then you start to see a change out to 6 months. And it's extremely noticeable that you get a shift in the odor profile as you go from fresh blood to decomposed blood. One thing that I don't have in this slide that was really interesting is I said I sampled 3 people. The blood from the 3 of us on fresh looked very, very different, but as it aged, it became very similar. Exactly the same way as when we're living. We have distinct odor profiles, and then as we decay, it all becomes very similar. I thought that was interesting. So we decided to go test the dog with this. So that dog, just by convenience, had never been trained on fresh blood, but the owner assumed that she would be able to locate it. And indeed, when we put out fresh blood, the dog did not recognize it. And the nice thing about being able to work hand in hand with the dogs in this case is that I did not train the dog. The trainer was could immediately go put fresh samples into her training regimen, and now we know that limitation, we can fix it, and now we're reducing false negatives by just barely adjusting her training protocol. All right, so switching over to training aids. You all probably know this, but there are no universally accepted methods for training or types of training aids. HRD training aids are probably one of the more complicated things to deal with. I am sorry. And I don't have a magical answer for you, but we can discuss them a little bit. So we know that training aids you want them to simulate all the possible odors that can be encountered in the field. So you need to keep in mind the stage of decomposition. You need to keep in mind that the whole body, when it has, particularly if it has the digestive tract involved, decomposes differently than when you just put out a body part or tissue or blood or bone. I actually think blood makes a very nice clean training aid because it does have all of the basic macromolecules that are throughout the entire body. However, nothing can substitute for searching for a whole body. That being said, training aids commonly include bone or gauze soaked in decomposition fluid is a good one. Sometimes if you have a nice medical examiner, they'll do that for you. Adipose sear, grave dirt, and then there's pseudoscents available. The problem with current training aids, as you probably know, is that they're biohazards, making them difficult to obtain and store safely. And then the pseudoscents are quite questionable. So I believe this is out of Sherry Forbes' lab also, but this is Katie, I want to say, Nezio, did this great study, again with pigs, big fan of pigs here, where they buried the pigs in cotton t-shirts to look and see if those would potentially could be used for training. And they exhumed the pig carcasses at different stages. Really, I just wanted to be able to put pictures of a pig wearing a t-shirt and shorts, honestly. Anyway, so they did laboratory analysis on these textiles and they compared it to the analysis of the pig, of another set of pigs that were not clothed to see if they were similar, because what they wanted to be able to see is that that textile would appropriately reflect the odor profile of the pig itself, and thus making it a good training aid. And they happily found that that t-shirt did make a very good training aid. It was very similar to the same odor profile of the pig itself. You still have the biohazard issue, so there is that problem. So in comes the scent transfer unit. This is a glorified dustbuster invented in the 90s, I want to say. The scent transfer unit, it is actually still owned by the FBI. They have a whole bunch of them in pallets in the evidence response warehouse area. But this was made for human scent dogs, for bloodhounds. You were able to take as you can see, this Paola Prada vacuuming up the scent of her subject there, and then she can give it to the bloodhound to go follow his trail wherever. It is a relatively crude instrument with legitimately a dustbuster type motor on the end, but it works quite well. And in my dissertation research, we applied this to non-contact sampling for HRD to make HRD training aids. So we did two different things. One, I obtained some of that lovely decomposition fluid soaked gauze from the medical examiner's office. And I also collected odor from bodies directly. So Horatio Kane here is showing you what I looked like when I was sampling the bodies, except, you know, with gloves and a mask and things. So then we were able to pull odor profiles off of those samples I took and compare them to the actual samples. And we saw quite a few similarities. Similar to the t-shirts, we were able to use a non-contact, so a method that did not involve us putting anything on the body, disrupting the body in any way, to create very good training aids, or potentially good training aids. And the nice thing about this is that the morgue in Miami did let me come in and do this because I wasn't touching the body. I wasn't going to remove any evidence. I stayed about 6 inches away, and I was able to create the training aids. So we then did a study with canines to see how they worked. So we took 8 trained HRD canines, and I used these lovely gauze pads up in these jars here. I sampled those with the STU for a given amount of time. So now the gauze, so on the STU has a gauze pad that now has odor that's not a biohazard. It's not a storage concern. And I could make a whole array of different types. And we sent these out to dog teams to test. And I got 8 out of 8 responses on the blood, the fresh remains of the decomp fluid, 5 out of 8 on the adipose sear. And out of all of the distractors that I sent, I only got 2 out of 40 false alerts. So those were quite effective. I have not done the study, but there have been 2 other studies looking at the Sigma pseudoscent, which I believe is the only commercially available pseudo. As I mentioned before, the human remains is made up of a lot. Yes. Everything okay?
Yes, Sigma right now is still the only commercially available company to produce pseudo.
Yeah, ScentLogix hasn't come up with a cadaver, right?
He's working on it.
Yeah, he said that for a while, so we'll see. But nonetheless, it's really difficult to make a pseudoscent because of all the things that we talked about. So there is one study, this Stradler et al., that I believe just did a chemical analysis, and then the Tipple et al. Did a chemical analysis and with canines. I might have that backwards. But either way, what they found is that the pseudoscents were much more simplistic than actual human remains odor, and many times it did not have any compounds overlapping. So the odorants that they saw related to actual human remains had no compounds in common with that of the Sigma. Furthermore, in the double-blind canine testing that they did with the certified, I believe these were FBI dogs, although don't quote me on that, they also did not get any positive responses to the Sigma formulations. So, as I said, I'm not giving you any solutions, unfortunately, but yeah, that's what I thought. That was the Tipple study. So, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so storage with, I talk a lot to other handlers about storage of training aids, but when I talk to them, it's mostly about, Michelle Mon just texted me to distract me while I'm speaking. So I'm now going to call her out on it in front of everyone. Okay, anyway, storage of training aids. When I talk to most handlers about storage, we're worried about cross-contamination or other kinds of contamination of the training aid. So are you getting your human odor all over the training aid? Are you packaging them together and then their odors are mixing? Are you getting the odor of the location where you hid something all over your training aid? And not that this isn't a concern for HRD, it definitely is, but you have additional concerns beyond that. Lucky you. So one of the big issues is that your remains will continue to decompose while in storage. So basically you have a living training aid that is changing its odor as you're storing it, unless you happen to have used a non-contact odor sample or you're using a mimic. And this is mostly because you have the microbes still working. So when you are storing something, you want to do it in such a way that slows the decomposition process, so your training aid isn't changing too much over time. Of course, you want to minimize contamination. That's always important for all training aids. And you want the decomposition to occur in the most natural way possible. So you don't want your training aid decomposing in a manner that is completely unlike the way it would in the real environment. So you want your training aid to continue to smell the same as if it were decomposing naturally. That is the really difficult one, and that one I unfortunately don't have a great answer. What I can tell you that works against you is when you do tightly close and restrict all the air, you are changing the environment. So you will get different types of decomposition that you would than you would if it was open in the environment. However, on the other side of that, when you don't tightly close thing, you're inviting contamination. So now if you have it not tightly closed in the refrigerator, you can get the smell of the refrigerator on your training aid, and that could throw your dog off. Storing the aids in the freezer does very much slow decomposition, but then we're going to talk about in a minute about the freeze thaw cycle changing the odor. So I have a slide on that in a minute. So Sherry Forbes did a study on the storage of blood training aids. You might not have looked at this one because it doesn't look necessarily relevant, but it is a very nice study comparing room temperature, refrigerated, and freezer storage of blood samples. And blood is doing research on blood training aids is a really good way to do a controlled study on human decomposition because it is just a smaller case study, basically. So looking at the room temperature samples, the number and the complexity of the odorants in the odor profile increased with time. So when she stored them at room temperature, she was watching active decomposition. When they were refrigerated, it did reduce biological degradation because you had your bacteria and the fungal activity were slowed. However, after 3 weeks, there was evidence of contamination from the refrigerator and the rubber tops of the vials on the sample. So the smell of the refrigerator was getting into her samples because of storage. And the freezer did actually increase the rate of decomposition, and she believes this is due to the lysing of the blood cells following freezing. She also saw, again, the contamination due to the refrigerator. So this is not super helpful, I realize, but there is more research necessary, and I hope if I get the funding that I will be starting this research shortly. This is a summary from that Forbes paper. The data is a little bit hard to follow, but what you're seeing on the left is the room temperature samples, seeing nice constant degradation over time. Refrigerated is a little more variable. I think the reason why those later ones look so much different than the earlier ones is because of the contamination from the refrigerator itself. And then if you look at the frozen, you've just got a whole different situation going on over there. If you look at frozen day 3 and day 4, I believe, or I'm sorry, day 3 and day 5, you can see a huge number of additional compounds. And that is where she talks about the possibly doing to the lysing of the cells. There's a nice freeze thaw study done by McCosey in 1986. He put, I believe they were rats or mice, I'm not sure, in the freezer, and then looked at the odor profile after thawing and compare that to freshly killed animals. And in the freeze thaw animals, he saw the predominant stage or the longest stage was the bloat stage, generally accelerated rate of decomposition across the board. And the freezing itself caused a weakening of the skin and the connective tissue, which allowed for aerobic degradation and disarticulation. So what he is saying is happening is basically it's decomposing from the outside in versus the freshly killed animals that decompose from the inside out. So here the predominant stage was the active decay, the anaerobic decay. A follow-up study was done by a PhD student at Florida National University, Dr. Carballo. Here she has some nice pictures, visual comparison to go along with the odor generated. So on the right, on the top is the freshly killed mice, I believe. And the bottom is the frozen. And then you can correlate that with on the left. This is kind of a strange chart, but basically this is total amount of odor detected off of each group at different times. So what you see is that the frozen thawed had significantly more odor and decomposed in a different manner than the freshly killed. So that was a lot. I am all done. And I mistyped my email here. That should be lauren.deGreeff@nrl.navy.mil. So if you have questions that you forget to ask me here, I would be happy to answer them at a later date. And I will stop sharing my screen if I can find Zoom again. There we go.
Okay, we can open this up for some questions. I know we've got one from Les. Once collected on galls, how long is odor available, i.e. if collected and mailed? Is there a difference between active versus passive transfer and how long odor stays on the galls?
That's a good question. I can tell you that I did send all of those gauze pads to dogs I was in Florida and I sent it as far away as Oregon. So it definitely stays on the gauze. Double containment is very important. So you want 2 layers of containment if possible, particularly if you're storing for a long time or shipping. I believe in that study, I used the aluminized bags that were heat sealed, and those were placed inside of ball jars with a good seal on them, I believe, if I remember correctly. I did find that the single layer of aluminized bag did not contain odor well, and I knew this because when I sent training aids, I got a lot more hits I got a lot more false alerts because there was cross contamination. So I had to send them new training aids that were packaged in a better manner. Active versus passive. That is a speed thing. You're just going to get the odor onto the gauze a lot faster if you're doing active, but passive absolutely works. It just will take a little bit longer. With active, there is a possibility that if you have too strong of a motor and you're pulling the air too fast, it actually will just be pulled through the gauze instead of staying on it. So in some manners, if you have the time, passive is quite effective. I think that was all of them.
I can speak from my personal experience of having to package stuff and take odor with me to Europe, that I've set my samples up, collected my samples, and several months later, the samples
Wow.
were smell it, but I could actively smell it.
Oh, nice. So the actual how long exactly that would last, I do not know the answer to that. It would depend on what temperature it's seen, how much odor was on there to begin with, how well is it really sealed. But it should definitely see. Now I'm gonna have this recorded and I'm gonna get quoted on this, and I'm really just guessing. But there is no reason that if it is sealed well and it's not put at elevated temperatures, that it shouldn't last for, I would say, months, but please, I'm guessing, so don't quote me on that anywhere.
This is one of those areas that hasn't been fully researched. This is one of those questions that,
Absolutely. I hope
like I said,
research like this soon.
I've been able to use the samples for months and then present it to how much source weight or volume did you use?
How much source weight? Oh, so I used, for the actual study with actual dogs, I used those, that gauze that was soaked in different mediums, if you will, that were in those spice jars. So I sampled from those spice jars. I also sampled from bodies at the morgue, but those were not used in the dog testing. Those were used for my odor profile experiments, but I just used, so we're talking very little. So the gauze that was soaked in blood or decomp fluid had a fair amount on it, but then there was gauze that was just placed on top of bone with adipose sear, and we had success with that as well. Have I tried
I'm
collecting
checking.
submerged source? I have not. I have not done work with
Submerged source. Submerged source is probably a whole nother kit and caboodle. Would
Not
it
to say
be
it couldn't be done.
possible?
Well, I feel like it could, but you kind of want to set that up in a somewhat artificial way, because you kind of want, I don't know, if I were gonna test that, I would take whatever my decomposing tissue or thing or whatever was, and I'd put it in almost like a bucket, and then put the STU or whatever you're doing your active or passive sampling with over the bucket, because that's kind of a and I wouldn't fill the bucket with tap water. I'd fill it with whatever relevant body of water is nearby. But you know where to sample that way. Having a body that's in like a lake and then trying to get a sample from that, you're going to get a lot of other odor with it. So you kind of want to contain that. Does that make sense?
Oh, I think it makes perfect sense, because one of the other things that I would think to potentially look at is like using a tad
Yeah, you could
and
just put
submerge that.
Oh yeah, that would be a great idea.
And then
The tad in the water, and then you
and
do.
that way, right,
Mm-hmm.
that way you don't have the interaction of the water or what might be in the water impacting the source itself.
Right. You kind of want to walk the line. You want it to be realistic. So you don't want to use, filtered water out of the tap, but you also don't want to pick up, you also want to control what you're doing and not pick up the dead fish odor that's in the same lake. So you have to walk that line of being realistic, but controlled.
So from over on Facebook, we've got a couple of questions.
Okay.
One of the questions is, so you do not recommend pseudoscience at all? As a handler, trainer, anthropologist, I say no. But I don't want to speak for Lauryn.
In the HRG world, that one I can easily answer. I don't like to wade into it on explosives or narcotics because it's complicated, but this one's pretty easy because there's not much available, and there's been multiple studies to show that it doesn't work well. So yeah, stay away from that, in my opinion.
Yes, this recording will be available later on Facebook there in the group, but it will eventually show up over on our YouTube channel. So another question from Facebook is some of my training aids are secured in a concrete form and then stored in glass mason jars separately, then stored in an ammunition box. What are your thoughts on the concrete and mason jars?
Are you using concrete as blanks? I mean, yeah, in your blanks also? So my thought on that was if you're using, as long as you're using the
I
concrete as a blank as well, that would be the most important part. And you don't want to reuse the concrete. Concrete is really porous and it's extremely hard to clean. So once it's seen odor, that's the only thing it can be used for. You can't swap the concrete around because it's impossible to get the previous odor off of it.
right. Another question from Facebook. Um, can you address the storage of bone short and longer term? Paper bag in a dry place, okay. Bury it in soil, freeze or do not freeze.
Wait, hold on. Go repeat. Sorry, I apologize. Repeat the beginning part of that to me again.
Can you address the storage of bone, short or
Oh,
long term?
I have not specifically worked with bone. You have less, so the thing you have to worry about with something like bone is that it has less odor coming off of it. So you don't have to worry about it contaminating other things. And the odor is probably not going to go away as long as you physically have bone there. But what you have to worry about with a training aid that has a low amount of odor is accidentally contaminating it with anything that has a higher amount of odor. So that might be plastic, that might be paper, anything that you can smell is going to impart its own smell onto that bone. And if you're not using the appropriate blanks or distractors, your dog can start cueing in on the other more pungent, for lack of a chemical term, lack of a pungent odor. They'll start cueing in on the plastic, for instance, that smell that's now imparted itself onto the bone, instead of the lower volatility odor from the bone itself, or the lower availability, I should say. So the most important thing is
Yeah,
whatever your inner layer that you're storing it in has got to be a low odor container. Same for teeth, to answer that question.
uh, as a anthropologist, I recommend archival storage boxes and things of that nature that are also acid free.
Oh, right.
Another question from Facebook. If we can get the morgue to place galls on a body, how many pieces of galls, how long, and where should we ask to place them? Example, 6 galls, 30 seconds each, one over mouth, stomach, over under shoulders, buttocks, etc.
That all sounds great. I'd say I don't even think it has to be 30 seconds. If they'll do 30 seconds, great. If they'll just swipe the body, we've had success with just swiping the body with the gauze, without even leaving it on there. But obviously the longer you leave it on there, the more odor is going to soak into it. Paul, do you have an opinion on body part?
I would say if you can get up around the mouth and then the larger surface area, such as the abdomen, and the definitely under like the buttocks. But and the reason why I say the mouth is because that's going to be the get some of the transference or the first off gassing from those internals, if that makes sense.
Right. So if you could get a somebody at a morgue to do six identical, like 6 gauze pads, all on the abdomen, for instance. The nice thing about that is you can start working thresholds with your dog with that. So you could put all 6 of them together, do training, and then work the dog down until they can get to 1 or even part of a gauze pad. Do you know this answer? Do you need to get some kind of legal permission to get sampling from the morgue? When I did it, I had to have, it was more of an issue with the university and safety, that the university and the morgue the lawyers had to get together and have an agreement, and it was safety based, but we did not have I don't know if we had a legal permission on the morgue side. Yeah. Paul, are you still there?
I am there.
Yes.
Sorry, I got
That's
booted
okay.
off for a moment, but this is going to be the last question. Mold, should the natural environment contaminate HRD with mold? Thoughts?
I would not touch that unless you have a really experienced dog. You don't want to start adding. It might be a good distractor. It might be a good thing to add to your target to see if it affects detection, but it would definitely not be something you do until the dog knew odor really well. What do you think, Paul?
I'm certainly in the belief that's going to be down the road with more advanced dogs. Definitely do not want anything like that in front of our younger dogs, as they're still learning odor, still learning commitment, and so forth. But would say anything that looks red or orange or so forth, I would caution you to be extremely cautious with, because some of those are very hazardous to play with. So, but again, thank you for everybody that has submitted questions, great questions. If you do have any more questions, happy to answer them. You can email her, or you can email me, and I will forward anything on to her. Like I said, this will show up in the YouTube, on the YouTube channel. That's HRD Specialized Canine Training. We try to get all of our trainers forum sessions on there. And then I want to introduce you to Dr. Michelle Mong. Again, I probably butchered that, but most of y'all will recognize her from TADS with Psy Canine. She will be joining us next month. It's going to be on a Sunday night, February 28th at 8 p.m. So, again, if you have any questions, please email me. Please visit the website, check out our future classes and other offerings. Again, one last time, thank you, Lauryn, for joining us tonight. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everybody who listened.
Stay safe, everybody. Don't lick anything. It's not good for your health.